Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?
Freeze, motherfucker!
Before learning that 2024 marks 20 years since the introduction of the Far Cry series, I had already decided to play through every Far Cry game in order of release, except for the Xbox exclusives, and finally put together my ranking list for this franchise. And this is a sequential list here. Those tier lists are for people who struggle with commitment and are afraid of upsetting people. This list will grow and change as we go, but at the moment it's pretty small and looks like this, with Far Cry 2 currently in the top spot and Far Cry 1 at the bottom. It should go without saying, but this is the internet, so I'm going to say it anyway, but this ranking is my personal preference. Far Cry 1 and 2 are very different games, and I imagine many people prefer the style of the first game over that of the second. After two such different titles, Far Cry 3 had a lot of freedom to either imitate one of its predecessors or to build off them and end up doing something completely different again. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much information about the making of this game, certainly not to the extent of the previous titles. Most of the behind the scenes stuff I found on YouTube is either about the live action promos that they filmed, which are admittedly rather brilliant and definitely worth a watch, or their retrospectives from people talking about how impactful the game was and how brilliant everything was and all this other nonsense which doesn't give much of an insight into their thought process going into this game. So I'm left with relying on the Wikipedia page and its links to get what little behind the scenes insight I can. If you watched my Far Cry 2 video, which you absolutely should because it's fantastic, hilarious and insanely cool, you may remember the bit about how Ubisoft wouldn't give the Far Cry 2 team an animation lead because their people were busy on other, more popular games like Assassin's Creed and Splinter Cell. It seems like this attitude majorly shifted for Far Cry 3, with Ubisoft clearly having a lot of faith in the product and throwing multiple studios at it. The company was overseen by Ubisoft Montreal, the same studio who made the last game, but with a completely different team. Once again, for anyone who doesn't remember, Ubisoft Montreal is a studio that basically makes all of your favourite Ubisoft games, and they also made Assassin's Creed Unity, but no one's perfect. With Ubisoft Montreal taking care of the bulk of the single player experience, they brought in massive entertainment to work on the multiplayer side of things. A part of the game that I have never touched, will never touch, and have no intention of talking about. But it is interesting to note that prior to working on the multiplayer for Far Cry 3, Massive had made the rather enjoyable World in Conflict RTS game and the first-person Desmond sections of Assassin's Creed Revelations. Not sure why these guys were chosen to put together the multiplayer mode for an open world FPS, but there you go. Is it any good? I doubt it, no one ever talks about it, but feel free to tell me how awesome it is in the comments. Ubisoft Shanghai were in charge of designing the missions and the wildlife AI, so you can thank them for that random leopard attacking you while you're trying to murder some humans. Ubisoft Bucharest were working on quality assurance. Red Storm Entertainment, the studio that was part founded by Tom Clancy to make all those Tom Clancy games, were responsible for the PC port, and believe me, I'm going to come back to that later, just you wait. And finally, they had Ubisoft Reflections assisting with the design of the vehicles, which I found interesting as I did feel that the driving in this game is a dramatic improvement over the last two, and knowing that the studio that created Driver were helping out with that made this make a bit more sense to me in hindsight. All of this is to say that Ubisoft were now fully invested in the Far Cry series and did not want to skimp on its support like it had done with the previous entry. The game started development shortly after Far Cry 2 had shipped, and over the next few years it saw a few changes of direction and an entirely new creative staff. The original narrative designer Patrick Redding wanted to continue to explore the African setting, and then creative director Raphael van Lierop, I'm probably mispronouncing that, wanted to bring the stories of the first two games together. For some reason I can't find an explanation for, Van Lierop left Ubisoft in 2010 and several others from the creative teams left with him. Ubisoft Montreal did not stick with the original vision for the game and instead seemingly decided to do the tropical island thing again and apparently focused on addressing the complaints made about Far Cry 2. For anyone who doesn't know, I did a series ranking the Assassin's Creed franchise, and while doing that I noticed a few games in the series that seem to directly address criticisms made of previous entries. This is just something Ubisoft does occasionally. It makes sense from a business point of view. I mean, people like your game but generally agree on things that could be done to make it better, so why not do those things and make a product more people will want to buy? It almost goes without saying that Far Cry 3 was a massive success, and many people point to this game as the turning point for open world shooters. The open world genre was still in its experimental stage prior to Far Cry 3, with different studios trying different things to see what works in that relatively new genre at the time. Far Cry 3 not only established the formula moving forward, but they printed it out onto a piece of paper, laminated it, rolled it up real nice, turned that son of a bitch sideways, and stuck it straight up the candy ass of almost every other development studio out there. Ubisoft themselves basically copied this formula and pasted it into most of its other franchises, and elements of this game are still being imitated and built on in releases to this day. Well, at the time of writing anyway. If you're watching this in 10 years time, that may no longer be true, and I'm sorry for having lied to you. Did Bloodborne get released on PC yet? I don't specifically remember buying this game, but this would have come out during my peak disposable income days, so I imagine I got this as close to day one as possible. I didn't pick up any collector's edition though, which surprises me, to be honest. I'd have thought I'd have been all over something like that. I also don't remember anything about the marketing prior to the release of the game, but I imagine it featured that definition of insanity cutscene because the box art makes some subtle references to things getting a little bit insane maybe. This box art did make me think about the narrative of the game from a slightly different perspective though, but we'll get into that a bit later. We'll kick things off properly here with a bit of a look at the story, so please consider this your spoiler warning as I will be talking about almost every bit of story and gameplay content here. And unlike the previous games, I do think that this is a narrative worth experiencing for yourself, rather than having some boring twat with mediocre gameplay abilities badly explaining it to you. The game opens with a montage of young, sexy rich people doing young, sexy rich people things, like skydiving, jet skiing, and dicking around in countries whose annual GDP is less than the allowance their daddies give them each month. We get a very brief introduction to each of them with their names flashing up, and the screen eventually pulls back to reveal that we are being shown this footage as it plays on a phone while we are locked inside a cage. The man holding the phone is called Vas, and we soon learn that he's a bit of an odd duck, this one.
Do you want me to slice you open like I did your friend? Shut the fuck up! Okay? I'm the one with the fucking dick. Look at me. Look me in the fucking eye. Hey! You fuck! Look me in the eye! You're my bitch. I rule this fucking kingdom. Shut the fuck up, or you die.
The story of Far Cry 1 was so firmly entrenched in 80s action movie stereotypes that the bad guy is just as forgettable as that bloke from Running Man or what's his face from Total Recall. Far Cry 2 gave us the Jackal, who managed to be an imposing and enigmatic presence throughout the game, even if his vocal performance was flat and seemingly sped up. Vas feels like the first of those points of criticism that Ubisoft wanted to correct with Far Cry 3. Far Cry 2 lacked memorable characters. Here's a character so memorable that people still talk about him 12 years later, helped to launch the motion capture and voice actor's career to new heights, managed to eclipse the actual main bad guy in the game, and create a high point that the development studios are still trying to match to this day. Vas is just as threatening, unpredictable, and unhinged as the internet says he is, and why they created this character and still felt the need to give him a boss to answer to, I will never understand. I'll get more into that later, but for now Vas threatens us, berates us, and insinuates that we are being held to ransom. Vas reveals our name to be Jason Brody, and the other chap in the cage with us is our brother Grant, who apparently used to be in the army, so he hatches an escape plan, while Jason just worries about it the whole time. We sneak through the camp to escape and get the usual basic tutorial stuff like crouching. We also get tutorials in using plants for cover, and we see the series introduction of the detection meter. An arrow will appear on screen when you catch the attention of a guard, and the arrow will grow bigger until they spot you and then go on alert. We also see the ability to throw rocks as a distraction returned from the first game after being removed from the second, and we also have the ability to properly climb certain structures like platform edges, window frames, hanging ivy, and any ledge with a little bit of rope hanging off it. We make our way through the camp, passing by piles of luggage strewn everywhere, suggesting that a lot of tourists have gone missing here, and we witness an execution or two. Seemingly escaped from danger, Grant starts talking us through the plan just as he gets shot in the neck. In a move seemingly just to allow the rest of the narrative to play out, Vaas gives us a head start to run away, and we are soon being chased through the jungle by dogs and angry men with guns. Jason gets jumped by a pirate and is forced to kill him in self-defense, marking his first kill. Understandably shaken, he is just having the worst day, Jason continues his escape through the jungle until a helicopter shoots the bridge out from beneath him. He blacks out as he hits the water, but awakens to see a chap called Dennis giving him a tattoo, because obviously that's what would happen, what else would you expect? Dennis wears a US Army shirt with his name on it, though he only lived in the US for a few years after leaving his home country of Liberia, and then he left the US because of all the racism. He eventually found himself on Rook Island, which is where Far Cry 3 takes place, and is also home to the Rakyat, the natives of the island. We later learn that Vaas, that kooky chap from earlier, is the brother of Citra, the leader of the Rakyat. I'm not 100% sure on the backstory, but I picked up that Vaas left the Rakyat to start his own pirate gang with blackjack and hookers, and eventually a chap called Hoyt turned up with some military spec hardware and started taking over, but using Vaas and his boys as muscle and keeping them in line with the supply of drugs. Hoyt is in the business of people trafficking, or it might just be the slave trade, I'm not sure, but he's also a bit of a drug dealer on the side as well. Dennis has been accepted as one of the Rakyat after Citra, quote, set him free, whatever that means, maybe sounds a little bit sexual. He clearly quite fancies her, and we see him struggling with the fact that she doesn't like him at a few points throughout the game. He's taken it upon himself to give you a tattoo because he and the rest of the Rakyat see your escape from Vaas's camp as a sign that you are some sort of prophesized hope for their people. They also don't call it a tattoo, they call it a tatal, which, being the sheltered white boy that I am, I don't know if that's just how some people say tattoo, or if it's the name for this specific pattern, or whatever it might be. Please do enlighten me in the comments. Dennis introduces you to the Rakyat and says that they will help you to find your friends, but because it's a video game, you have to help them first, and the first thing you need to do is to climb a tower. Far Cry 3 isn't the first time we've seen climbable towers in games before. 5 years before this game, there was another little game called Assassin's Creed, which had a mechanic that involved you climbing to the top of towers scattered around the world that would reveal the surrounding areas of the map, including world details and quest markers. I may be incredibly wrong here, but this stands out to me as the first example of Ubisoft pretty clearly taking a mechanic from one of their games and sticking it into another one with some different paint on it. They would eventually go on to do the same thing with the entirety of Far Cry 3, but for now it's just the towers from Assassin's Creed. There are 18 of these scattered around the game's 2 islands, and while you certainly could complete the game without doing any other towers, you're gonna have a much easier and much more fun time if you do a few of these. Not only do they reveal part of the map to help you get around, they also reveal which animals can be found in which area, and more importantly, also unlock new weapons that you can acquire for free. So these things make exploration easier and give you more options to kill people with. Why wouldn't you do them? Oh, right, the repetitiveness. Obviously, these things are a bit more tedious when it's been 12 years since they started appearing in more and more games, but I do feel like these fit well into the world and they make sense as an activity, and they are all different at the very least, with each climb feeling like a miniature environmental puzzle. Not a difficult puzzle, though a couple of them on the second island did give me a little bit of bother for a couple of seconds. They also give you a passive reminder of the world you are exploring, as the climb will provide some scenic views of the surrounding island. This is something that I likely didn't appreciate back on release, but I did this time around, but I'll get into that more when I start talking about the fast travel system. Reaching the top of the tower and removing the jamming device plays a little video of the camera swooping around the area, highlighting some points of interest. What it doesn't do is add any of these points of interest to your map, so you better just try and figure out where anything interesting was and hope it was near a unique looking tree or something. There will always be a couple of zip lines to help you get down quickly, as a leap of faith would be a little out of place in this setting. So you zipline back down to Dennis, who now wants you to learn how to master the jungle if you want any chance of saving your friends. Turns out mastering the jungle involves killing 2 boars and picking some flowers, but this does at least teach us the fundamentals that we'll need to get through this adventure. This little task serves as a tutorial for pretty much the rest of the major mechanics of the game. We've been taught how to sneak around and how to open our map, and now we need to learn how to read our mini-map and how to collect and craft resources. We also learn how to shoot things, which is pretty handy. It seems like some developers these days feel that crafting mechanics are a required part of open world games, and personally I tend to roll my eyes at their inclusion most of the time. But back in 2012, this was something not often seen in games like this, and at the time I appreciated the options it opens you up to. If you wanted to carry more bullets or more money, it would tell you how many skins of which animal you would need. You check your map to see where they are and off you go. Treat yourself. Even back then, I did find it funny that I need the skins of multiple sharks in order to craft a larger wallet, something which I assume will still fit in my jeans pockets. And if I wanted to carry more bullets, then only the freshest hides of several dingoes would suffice, never mind the horde of deer I just took out with a rocket launcher, or the human flesh lying scattered across the island thanks to my antics. Wouldn't that do for some nice new bags?
You haven't thought of the smell, you bitch!
The fact that you can upgrade your carry capacity necessitates that you start the game barely able to carry anything. You start with only 1 weapon slot and a low maximum ammo count, so in order to fully embrace this game, you will need to pop into the jungle to murder some woodland creatures. The start of the game does feel incredibly restrictive with these carry limits, and while admittedly it doesn't take much effort to harvest the leather you need to stop worrying about picking things up so much, it does feel needlessly limiting. The final unlock in each category will require you to kill a specific legendary creature, one which can only be found during special hunting missions. I'll get into those in a bit more detail later, but because it's not made clear which of these missions will result in you hunting these special animals, and because the second highest unlock for each category was more than enough for me, I didn't bother with them during my main playthrough. Sure, I went back and did them later, just to see what they were like, but for me the effort required was not worth the reward. You won't be able to travel far around Rook Island without spotting some coloured leaves on your minimap. Now, these come in 5 different colours: red, yellow, blue, green and white, which gives you some indication as to what sort of syringe they will let you craft. Generally speaking, green makes healing stuff, yellow does perception-y things, red is for damage resistance, blue is for swimming, and white is for... Actually, I don't know, I didn't pay that much attention by this point. I played through the game on hard difficulty, and all I really needed were healing syringes and the yellow ones that let you see animals through the terrain. But there are others that let you breathe underwater for longer, reduce fire damage, and other things like that. But again, I didn't mess with much of that as I never really felt the need to. What did annoy me about this, especially in the early game, is that a single leaf from a flower will take up just as much inventory space as the pelt of a buffalo. So if you start picking flowers too much, you'll run out of space for loot to sell. On the subject of loot, scattered around the game are these boxes, right? And they have loot inside them. Almost like some sort of loot box, but they usually contain a little bit of money and a watch, or surprisingly regularly fetish items based off specific animals. I'm not one to yuck anyone's yum, but maybe stop leaving your kinky toys in wooden boxes at work, please? Just because you're slavers doesn't mean you can't maintain professionalism. This loot serves only to be sold at shops for cash, which you can then use to top up your ammo or buy weapons and armor. You can also loot the corpses of fallen pirates if you can be bothered to watch the same animation play out for each of the 30 men you just massacred, but Far Cry 3 can also get very picky about exactly where you need to stand to activate a loot animation or even just to pick stuff up. Ammo will be picked up automatically when you walk over a weapon, but weirdly you need to specifically tell the game that you want to pick up any cash that you find, which does sound like an incredibly minor and picky thing to moan about, but seriously, the amount of time this causes temporary inconvenience builds up into a significant annoyance. There's also the issue of finding corpses of either fallen enemies or dead animals in tall grass, as they don't appear on your minimap and tend to be hidden, meaning you better keep an eye on that tiger you just sniped from the other side of the valley or you'll lose its hide forever. Far Cry 2 didn't have a minimap, and instead quite famously had you read from a map in real time, forcing you to put your gun away in order to get your bearings. Far Cry 3 has no such limitation, as the minimap is in the corner of your screen at all times, highlighting plants for you to collect and any enemies that you've tagged. It will also highlight mission areas and restricted zones, so while this is an undeniably useful bit of heads-up display, I was a little bit dismayed of having to use it. Without mods, or at least as far as I can tell without mods, there is no way to remove this minimap. But then even if there was, it's been made such a crucial tool that I feel like certain elements of this game would become a massive pain in the ass without it. First and foremost, it shows you the roads and paths around you so you can keep an eye on junctions and sharp turns coming up. Finding plants without it would be tricky, as healing plants are coloured green, which would be difficult to spot in this game because half of your screen is usually some sort of green. But my main gripe with the map system in this game is when you're travelling from A to B. I mentioned earlier that Ubisoft Reflections were helping out with the vehicle side of this game, and it really does show. After 2 games of passably functional cars and trucks, the driving in this game feels exciting and intense. Whether you're in a little 2-seater commuter, an armoured jeep, a quad bike or a jet ski, the sense of speed and controllable danger each and every vehicle provides makes for a traversal system that I actually wanted to take part in. While you can carry a vehicle repair tool around with you to fix your cars after a few bumps, I never did because it takes up a weapons slot, which seems like such a stupid idea that whoever suggested it needs a slap and whoever approved it needs a kick.
You bitch!
But vehicles just aren't as fragile as they were in Far Cry 2. And this is good because having to stop every 5 minutes to fix the engine would disrupt the flow of screaming through tree-lined dirt roads and drifting around cliff-top hairpins. The best way I can think to describe it is that driving feels like you're always almost about to lose control, but you're able to just hold on and pull through and make it. And in that regard, it kind of reminds me of spending the night with your mum. There are timed race events scattered around the map that highlight these driving mechanics, and I would often go out of my way to take part in these just because I was having so much of a good time with them. I don't remember this happening in any of the Far Cry games after this, but then maybe I've just forgotten after all this time, but the driving is something I don't remember seeing anyone really talking about with this game, and I feel like it needs highlighting and having its praises sung a little bit, even if it's just from some dickhead that no one listens to like me. So while you don't have to stop driving every 5 minutes to fix your car after a particularly hefty bump, I did find myself having to pause every so often to bring up the map screen. Like I said, the in-game map from Far Cry 2 is gone, with the minimap seemingly being the replacement for it. However, I found the minimap range to be too small while tearing around at top speed, so I did have to pause the game to open the map screen to plan out my route, which felt like such a step back in terms of immersion from the last game. Again, this probably sounds like such a pointless thing to be bitching about, but when I'm having fun in a game, I don't want to have to keep completely removing myself from that fun. Let me check my map in-game and risk falling off a cliff or running over a goat or something. As much as I did enjoy the driving, I did still heavily rely on the fast travel system due to the sheer size of the map. To unlock fast travel points, you need to clear enemy outposts, which leads us on to the next little mission Dennis has for us. Now that we've killed a couple of hairy pigs and picked some flowers, he reckons we're ready to kill a camp full of pirates to save our friend Daisy. You'll spend the vast majority of your time with this game attacking enemy outposts, and these are something which again feel like a direct response to criticism of the last game. Again, almost famously, enemy outposts in Far Cry 2 would fill back up with enemies mere minutes after you've already wiped them all out. As I mentioned in my Far Cry 2 video, this was done because they didn't want a player to clear the entire map and find themselves with no enemies to kill. Seemingly though, this is what we players actually wanted, so now the map is covered in enemy outposts just waiting for you to capture, and they stay captured for the rest of your game, reducing the amount of enemy soldiers you find in the surrounding areas. Outposts are also generally more widely approachable, in that you can come at them from different angles, scouting them out properly before making your way inside. Something I don't remember seeing a tutorial for, so having to look up the button prompt, was for your camera, which allows you to tag enemies like in the first game, something else that was removed for Far Cry 2. Unlike in Far Cry 1 though, tagged enemies will now be visible through walls and terrain, rather than just appearing on your minimap. This, along with those stealth mechanics we were taught at the very start of the game, allow for a much more accessible stealth approach than either previous game. Sure, stealth was possible, but Far Cry 2 in particular seemed anti-stealth with its lack of enemy tagging and everything being various shades of brown, making enemies tough to spot. So while Far Cry 3 may not offer mechanics to satisfy the hardcore stealth fans, dipshits like me can hide in the hedges and keep an eye on the heavily armoured twat on the other side of the wall fairly easily. Apparently Far Cry 3 runs on the Dunia 2 engine, a step up from the Dunia engine used in Far Cry 2, which itself was an evolution of the Cry engine used in Far Cry 1. Dunia 2 apparently allows the world to be procedurally generated, but then various teams went in and adjusted and made tweaks to the world to make it more cohesive and fun to play in. Enemy outposts here feel like real places, like petrol stations, junkyards or storage facilities and farms, and each outpost will have at least one alarm post and many of them will have caged animals. If you can shoot out one of the alarm posts, it will deactivate that specific post. If you can get right up to it and turn it off though, it will deactivate all the other posts in the camp. This is important because other than getting an XP reward for not triggering alarms while capturing an outpost, a triggered alarm will start a timer that brings in reinforcements, which is usually about 2 trucks full of dickheads that know exactly where you are and are keen to end your life. You also get an extra reward for not getting spotted, but I didn't get this very often because of my incredibly mediocre skill level. Animal cages can be shot open, which will release whatever pissed off creature is inside to generally cause havoc and provide a bit of a distraction. If it's just an angry dog, then it won't take too long for the guards to put it down, but if it happens to be a tiger or a bear, you can usually sit back and let them clear the camp out for you. Just make sure you do sit back out of the way just in case it spots you and makes a beeline for your genitalia. Now I think this might be my memory getting similar games mixed up, but I seem to remember random animal attacks being a much more common thing in this game. This may be a more regular occurrence in Far Cry 4, and it probably happens all the time in Primal, but in Far Cry 3, while it is possible for animals to randomly attack you out in the world, for me it only really happened twice. Once was a tiger as I was actively attacking a camp, and another time a leopard jumped me as I was scouting out an outpost. There were other times when I spotted a group of coyotes sauntering towards me as I was creeping through the bushes, and more times than I care to admit I got jumped by a snake that I hadn't been paying attention to, but this was not nearly as common a thing as I was expecting it to be. Again, maybe this is something they had more of in future games, I guess I'll find out as I keep playing through them. It occurred to me during this playthrough though that this is almost a sort of mechanical replacement for the malaria attacks from Far Cry 2, though I guess the animal attacks don't require you to go off and complete a specific side mission every so often like the malaria thing did. Like many games that promise to let players, quote, approach situations in any way you like, you really only have 2 options when approaching outposts in Far Cry 3. You go in loud and guns blazing, or you stealth your way through. Luckily, both approaches are fun to play, with the heap of stealth mechanics that we've already talked about being complemented with takedowns, another new feature of this game. These can be upgraded through a series of unlocks, and eventually you can run a knife through one guy and 2 of his nearby mates, pull the pin out of a grenade on the 3rd dude and kick him into a group of other bastards. Or you can jump on one chap and throw one of his knives into the neck of his mate way over there. But combat isn't just restricted to knives, we get a pretty wide range of guns to play with here too. So let's take a quick look at the shooting. Roll the montage. Guns don't jam anymore like in Far Cry 2. Different people will either be pleased or disappointed to hear that, and while on the face of it I did very much enjoy the unexpected chaos caused by that mechanic, I do appreciate the ability to add silencers and different sight types to pretty much any gun. I also very much appreciate that, like the first game, we once again have 4 weapon slots to do whatever we want with. So if you want to run around with a rocket launcher, a grenade launcher, an automatic shotgun and a machine gun, well you go right ahead and do that, you've earned it. There's a decent range of guns on offer here, from various sizes of handguns, SMGs, assault rifles, snipers, LMGs and launchers, all of which can be given different paint jobs, and many of them have various mods that can be added to them. There's also a bow and arrow, as this game was released right around the time that sort of thing was becoming a bit trendy, though I didn't use it too much as that required a separate bag to be upgraded to be worth doing, and I already had so much animal blood on my hands I was starting to feel a bit guilty and hungry. The weapons all felt satisfying to shoot, at least to me, and they all sound exactly how my uninformed British arse felt like they should. Older LMGs rattle around, 44 Magnums sound like thunder, and Spaz shotguns are so fun to use I honestly couldn't hear them over the sound of my erection. Mines and explosive packs are also assigned to separate buttons rather than taking up a weapon slot like the last game, so I actually got to experiment with these a little bit to lure enemies into traps. Overall, I found the combat in this game to be of exceedingly high quality, and your ability to scout out enemy positions, plan an attack, and then have that plan go to shit because a random patrol or tiger turned up continued that sense of overlapping systems of chaos that I loved from the previous games, and I think that it's that aspect that makes a Far Cry game stand out and stick in people's minds. All of the various systems cross over every so often to create an experience that would almost be possible to recreate, giving you a truly unique experience. All of that shooting and bear fighting will ultimately result in you getting a bit hurt, and the health system has also undergone some changes since Far Cry 2. A medical syringe will initially only heal you for 2 health bars, which you can eventually upgrade to fill your eventual maximum health bars of 6. Each health bar will slowly regenerate if it's not fully depleted, and if you run out of healing syringes, then pressing the heal button will play out one of those lovingly gruesome healing animations that the Far Cry series is famous for. You could be pulling shrapnel out of your arm, or applying a bandage to your arm, or applying another bandage to your arm to that same spot again, or put another bandage on the exact same spot again, or... Wait a minute, there's only like 3 animations here. I mean, there are more than that, I think, but I hardly experienced the vast differences in uncomfortable self-help that Far Cry 2 offered. It almost feels like they forgot about these until the last minute and just chucked a few quick ones in to keep people happy. Maybe there are more that just take specific injuries to trigger, but like the animal attacks, this was something I was expecting much more of and was disappointed with the limited variety that I received during my playthrough. Anyway, where were we? Oh yes, taking the outpost. Dennis gives you a couple of chaps to help you take your first outpost, and these guys will sit back and do nothing until you start shooting, which I believe is the only time you get this sort of dependable assistance. Sure, other friendly patrols might happen to pop by while you're already in a gunfight and help out, something that happened to me on a couple of occasions. But thinking about it, it seems like a missed opportunity to not let you bring some friendlies with you into a shootout. We clear the camp and find out that Daisy has been moved elsewhere, and we have the option of going after her or dicking around on our own for a bit, because this is where the game fully opens up to you. Other than pretty much removing all enemy NPCs from the surrounding area, taking over an outpost will provide you with a place to buy weapons and equipment, and will usually give you a couple of optional quests to do through the job board. These quests come in 2 flavors, hunting animals or hunting people. I talked about hunting animals earlier, and these missions task you with killing a number of a specific animal with a specific weapon, be that deer with a bow and arrow or dingoes with a shotgun. Later on there are legendary animals to hunt down, which as I mentioned are required to craft the final unlocks of each type of bag. The human hunting missions are a bit different, and usually task you with killing an enemy captain with your knife, meaning you will have to get up close and personal and stick to the shadows to take down your target. These missions all reward you with some extra money, and the hunting missions let you keep the weapons you use. But I didn't find myself engaging with these much, as I found the story missions, racing and outpost capturing to be more than entertaining enough for me. These quests becoming available after your first outpost battle did make me chuckle a bit at the sudden and dramatic character development this implies of young Jason Brody. Literally about 10 minutes ago he was in shock at having to stab a man to save his own life. Since then we've got a douchey tribal tattoo, killed a couple of pigs and picked some flowers, and suddenly we're able to take out an entire enemy camp and are being offered fucking assassination contracts and big game hunting challenges. I know it's a game and we want to be able to do that stuff, but Jason suddenly becoming a bad man because Dennis told him he was cool just makes me chuckle a little bit.
Well, you all know what laughter sounds like.
Taking outposts also creates a fast travel point. Yes, gone are the limited bus stops of Far Cry 2, and instead we have a fast travel system that you can use at any time to get around when you need to. To my mind, there are pros and cons to this, and I honestly couldn't say which system I prefer. The Far Cry 3 system means you can get around very quickly and easily, but this comes at the expense of learning the environments, and it's likely that there will be many parts of the island that you only see once because you have no reason to go back to some places. The fast travel and the map screen changes made between the games are undeniably more convenient compared to the last game, but I feel that this comes at the expense of player immersion. But then how much that matters to anyone else depends on the individual, so this is likely very much a me problem. I will say though that I still vividly remember part of my first time playing this game, when after taking my first outpost and exploring around, I eventually came across a car driving towards me. When the occupants of said car didn't immediately jump out and try to murder me, I was amazed and relieved beyond reason, and having just played through Far Cry 2 again, there is still a little bit of that when it first happened during this playthrough. Enemy soldiers will roam around and get stuck into a fight if one happens to kick off near them, and the locals will be tootling around to the shops or whatever, usually happy enough to pull over and let you take their car. This is such a nothing feature these days, but for anyone who wasn't there at the time, you have to understand just how much of a breath of fresh air this was back on release. The rest of the story sees Jason find and rescue his friends one by one, which, like any good video game, requires you to complete a couple of quests for other people first.
Blitzkrieg!
After the bland and forgettable characters from Far Cry 2, it feels like substantial effort has been made here to make sure you remember the characters' names throughout this game, or at the very least make you able to describe them to someone else.
Look after yourself, eh? History lesson over.
We first meet Dr. Earnhardt, some sort of horticulturalist who very much enjoys getting high on his own supply. This chap offers your friends somewhere to hide out from Vars's men until you can all figure out how to escape the island, and he also gives you your first drug trip of the game, but I'll talk about those properly later on. We later meet a CIA agent who seems to be going a little off the rails having been here so long. I'm pretty sure Agent Willis turns up in Far Cry 4 too, but here he's just an over-the-top stereotype of an American patriot who has been away from home for a little bit too long. He's the guy that gives us a flamethrower and sends us on that famous mission that everybody seems to remember from this game, the one where you have to burn the weed fields. This mission does stand out because a Skrillex track plays while you burn the herb, but other than a licensed song being used, I didn't find this mission to be anything spectacular or special. If it didn't have the music playing, it wouldn't have felt much different to anything else we've done so far, though I do appreciate that the screen will start to go a bit wobbly and more colourful if you stand too close to the burning narcotics. This seems like a good place to mention that the fire effects in Far Cry 3 are not as impressive as they were in the last game. It just doesn't feel as dangerous or unpredictable as it did in Far Cry 2, and this seems like such an odd way to go with it, considering how big of a deal it was in that last game. I don't need to say any more about it though, as every time a new Far Cry is released, there will be videos made comparing the fire effects at the very least, so go and find one of those for a more coherent opinion on digital flame propagation. Willis helps us to get some intel on Vars and his boss Hoyt, and helps us to locate more of our friends. We rescue Oliver while he's being transported for sale, and then find out that Keith has been sold to a chap named Buck.
Right.
And he likes to, well, you know.
Right.
Buck also likes treasure, and says that if you track down a specific dagger for him, which just happens to be a dagger that Jason saw in a vision, which I'll get back to, I promise, I already said I would, he will let you leave with Keith. Buck is a bit of an odd duck, because he seems to know exactly how and where to find the pieces of an artifact that will lead you to the dagger he is looking for, so I'm confused as to why he doesn't just do it himself and keep his little pet slave Keith. But I guess that this is a good time to talk about those drug visions I promised to get to. See, you didn't have to wait too long. Prior to meeting Buck, we've already gone on a couple of drug trips, a feature which would go on to be something of a staple feature of the franchise. Far Cry 4 and Primal feature many drug trip missions. I think one boss in 5 uses them quite a lot, and I haven't played the others, so I guess I'll find out how much drugs they feature soon enough. The first trip in Far Cry 3 is when Dr. Earnhardt sends us to collect some mushrooms to help him make a cure for whatever Daisy had, and this plays out like most drug trip sections in games. The screen goes funny and things move around in unexpected ways. The next trip, however, comes later in the game when we meet Citra, the leader of the Rakyat. Dennis introduces us to her and she tells us about how Hoyt came to the island and got Vaas addicted to drugs, which is why he is subservient to him. We then have to drink a potion, which apparently only the strong will survive, and we go on another adventure through the mine. However, this section shows us people, places, and events that we haven't experienced yet, and clearly shows us the item that Citra wants us to recover for her, suggesting that rather than a mere hallucination, this is some sort of prescient vision, almost like we've just had some of the spice melange. Willis and the village we find him in are featured in that vision, as is the image on the back of the box of us holding a gun to Vaas's forehead. During our mission for Buck, we have to assemble parts of a compass that lead us to the dagger that he wants, which happens to be the same dagger we saw in that vision. Those compass pieces glow and shimmer the air around them when we look at them, and as this happens I started to wonder whether there's supposed to be some sort of magic going on, or whether Jason is supposed to be tripping his testicles off and is just seeing magic stuff happen. I mean, he is injecting himself with herb mixtures every 10 minutes or so to keep his health up, so it's a reasonable possibility. The next drug trip happens when we kill Buck, which Jason seems oddly horrified by, and return the dagger to Citra. We see more weird, fantastical stuff, and then have a boss fight with a giant demon figure that we've seen in murals in the Rakyat temples. As we finish off this creature, we awaken to see Citra riding us like a champion, though hilariously Jason has refused to remove his boots or his jeans for this act. I've seen people analyse this scene to death, saying that the arrows we fire are actually Jason shooting loads into Citra, and that makes me feel dirty just saying that, and while I guess I can see that connection, I think they just wanted to add some boobs into their game to keep the lads interested. Then again, I do think that Citra riding you like a Grand National Stallion is an important part of the story. Jason goes from a seemingly fairly average dude who is thrown into a horrific situation to a heroic warrior savior of an entire nation, seemingly just because he's taught to believe in himself. Everyone around him tells him how awesome and special he is, and how great of a warrior he will become, and I think Citra getting nasty with him is an important part of that, as it's stroking his ego and fueling that animalistic side of himself. Then again, I think the drug trips work into the insanity angle that the back of the box is keen to drive home. How much of any of this is actually happening? All the major boss fights in this game take place in either drug visions or some sort of hallucinations, and we regularly wake up to a completely unexpected scene. How much of this is actually happening? How much are we being manipulated by the people around us? While the Rakyat are busy stroking our ego and making us feel great, our friends are largely doing the opposite, especially Lisa, who is Jason's girlfriend. She recognises that Jason is changing and becoming more confident, having now found a path for himself in life, but that path is murdering his way through hordes of angry slavers across a remote tropical island, and she talks about it like he's just taken on a new job that has longer working days.
I miss you. Okay, and you're carrying all these weapons and you have all these weird tattoos and I'm not saying you shouldn't go rescue them. I'm just worried it's affecting you.
Lisa, don't worry. I'm taking control of my life for the first time.
I know, you're
That's
right.
a good thing.
You've been working really hard on that, and I have a studio job waiting for you. I helped Steve.
Oh, look, I don't want to talk about your exes right now. All right, this is my path. I've got to find it on my own.
Okay. Okay. I get it. You're stressed out. We can meet up later. I love you. Now go. Before I try and stop you again.
I did laugh at the one bit where you've just been off killing pirates and saving another couple of your friends from certain death, and she shows you this little cross that she's made for your brother, which is just two sticks tied together. Cheers, love. Brilliant. Very good. Have you seen the life draining from behind my eyes as I slowly become numb to human suffering? Daisy, on the other hand, is spending her time trying to fix a boat so that they can all leave, which, while useful on the face of things, did make me wonder why she's bothering when surely Jason could just steal a working boat? No? Jason's friends barely come into things really, and are just there to give you some other reason to keep fighting through all of this, though that slowly gets replaced by Citra wanting you to kill Vaas and Hoyt and save the Rakyat, and Jason gradually comes to accept his place as saviour of her people. After the sex with socks on in front of several half-naked dudes, Jason sets off to finally kill Vaas. We have encountered him several times during the game up to this point, and again, this guy really is the start of the show. The only negative notes I have about him is that he isn't the main bad guy, which is hardly an original thought, and it is odd that he doesn't just shoot us in the head several times or burn us alive or something. Again, I understand that this is a game, and that would be a pretty shit ending, but for a man this unhinged and violent, it seems odd that he keeps leaving it to chance that he will die. It's like that guy in John Wick that leaves the room instead of staying and watching him get executed. It only happens so that the game or movie or whatever can continue to happen, and with insane characters like Vaas, it sticks out as an odd character choice to not violently murder us. Anyway, we head to Vaas's camp and fight our way through before killing him in a drug trip quick time event. I know people are genuinely disappointed that this fight is pretty much entirely a QTE, but honestly I'm not sure how you could do a satisfying boss fight in a mostly realistic first-person shooter. Humans die pretty easily, so having him be a bullet sponge would suck, as would having him be indestructible but only weak to environmental hazards or something. I guess another drug trip god boss thing could work, but all in all I was quite happy with the QTEs in this game because at least they're fast and fluid, unlike others where the game will slow down just in case you're not quite paying attention, so it keeps that tension while you're anticipating which button you'll have to hit next. In the years since this game's release, I've seen people mentioning something called post-Vaas syndrome, and honestly I felt that here too. Vaas should have been the end of the game. The guy who's been making our lives miserable this whole time is finally dead. We're done here. It's over. But no, there's still his boss who we've been told about quite a bit but not really shown, and there's a whole second island to explore. Remember when people realised that by completing No Man's Sky you just restarted in a new universe? This felt a bit like that to me with the second island. We're more than 2/3 of the way through the game at this point, so an entire new island seemed like overkill, and judging by the limited amount of missions and the new mechanics introduced, I think that's a justified opinion. Willis drops us off on the island via plane and gives us a wingsuit to make sure we land safely. This wingsuit should have been introduced much earlier than this. The glider in the original Far Cry was some sort of big selling point, or at least I certainly remember people going a bit mad over it, likely due to the sheer size of the levels that would allow such a method of transportation. Far Cry 2's map was relatively flat in comparison, and only had a couple of fairly scripted instances where a glider would actually be useful. Rook Island has much more verticality to it, which once again makes this series staple a viable and useful option. But the wingsuit gives you that verticality and chucks in a reliably safe landing method too in a reusable parachute. The fact that this was saved until almost the end of the game baffles me. And I assume there are mods out there that give you access to this from the very start, but this really should have come much earlier. The second island is made up of Hoyt's mercenary guards, which we have fought a few of before arriving here. These guys are more heavily armoured and carry more powerful weapons, which initially makes them tougher to fight than Vaas's men. But the thing is, you can almost instantly get access to these more powerful weapons, which negates the stronger armour of the mercenaries, meaning that in practice they are no more difficult to kill than the pirates we've been fighting for the entire rest of the game, so really we just get a little bit of a palette swap with the enemies. We also get hold of an enemy uniform, allowing us to traverse the island without any drama as long as we don't enter any restricted areas, which happens to be any and all outposts, and as long as we don't start shooting people, which seems fair enough. While it is explained away in the story, it smells to me like a little bit of an apology for throwing an entire new island at you after spending so long on the last one. Yes, there are all these new towers to climb, but you can essentially skip most of the combat now if you want to, so you can have an easier time of it. We meet up with an American agent with a strong German accent named Sam, who is a colleague of Agent Willis and will help you to kill Hoyt. Along the way, we burn a few more drug fields and beat up Jason's other brother, who we thought was dead, in order to maintain his cover as a mercenary. Jason and Sam convince Hoyt that they are two awesome dudes, and he eventually agrees and invites them round for a game of poker. This game goes a bit south though, as Hoyt reveals that he knows who we are and tries to kill us both, before we enter another seemingly out of nowhere hallucination and kill him, and apparently all of his guards in another trippy QTE. Once again, I do think that Hoyt is a good protagonist, being just as unpredictable and dangerous as Vaas, but just in a less manic way. He reminds me somewhat of Pagan Min from what I can remember about him, and I think that if he was the only boss in any other game, he'd be talked about fondly as a memorable villain. But because someone decided that he should share the stage with Vaas, he is overshadowed and outperformed. Plus he just looks fairly generic, he's just a dude in a suit, like, we've got loads of those. We then have a quick section where we have to rescue our brother from an airport and shoot our way out of there to the tune of Flight of the Valkyries. By this point, Jason has already told his friends that he wants them to go home and to leave him on the island, because he's found his place and wants to stay. After saving his thought-dead brother, he finds Dr. Earnhardt's home destroyed and goes to see Citra to see what has happened and to tell her of Hoyt's death. Citra takes your brother captive and blows drugs in your face, leading to another drug trip sequence which drives home that point I made earlier about the Rakyat essentially worshipping the ground you walk on, and your friends, or rather specifically Lisa, have a go at you for being weird. You wake up to find yourself with that dagger from earlier at the throat of Lisa, and you are given the choice of either killing or saving your friends. Two options which I have mixed feelings about. Option A is to save your friends, and this, at least to me, feels like the most complete ending and is likely the canonical choice. You save your friends, apologise to Citra and leave the island, but not before Dennis pops up all offended and accidentally stabs Citra instead of you. The guy was clearly crushing hard on her this whole time, so he gets a bit upset by this. All the white people leave the island to what I assume will be a bit of a power struggle left in this vacuum, with all the leaders of both sides of the conflict being killed, so it's hardly a happy ending. The other ending sees you slit Lisa's throat before suddenly cutting to you ploughing Citra and impregnating her with the ultimate warrior right before she gets all praying mantis and does some penetrating of her own, right through your chest with a dagger. You bleed out and die. The end. This honestly seems like the logical end of the game to me, considering the narrative. Jason gets swept up in all this mythos where he is constantly being told how powerful he is, all the while being filled with drugs and being worshipped by everyone. It feels in character that he would give in and remove his old life to be able to live out this wild fantasy for the rest of his existence, even if it does only last 20 seconds. Or however long people generally have sex for. It's about 20 seconds, right? It can't be much more than that, surely. So while this felt to me like the appropriate ending for the story, it feels underdeveloped, as is often the case with games that have multiple endings. The quote proper ending will get properly fleshed out, and the others are quite often just thrown together quickly before the developers went for their lunch break. I mean, they couldn't even create a pair of naked legs for Jason, so even in his final triumphant shag, he is still wearing his jeans and boots. So that would just about do it for Far Cry 3. This is almost objectively a point-by-point improvement on Far Cry 2, with improved traversal mechanics, added player convenience, a more natural feeling world to explore, and characters so memorable that people are still trying to emulate their success to this day.
Hello?
It's just a shame about the final act of the game feeling like a needless bolt-on just to pump up the runtime. However, there is still one other issue to discuss which plagued my playthrough, and this is just the PC version of the game. I imagine that if you play this on a console, it will run just fine, but this thing came out in 2012, when PC gaming was going through a little bit of a turbulent time. Luckily, this was not subject to the torment of games for Windows Live, as that was close to being shut down at the time Far Cry 3 was released. It did require Uplay though, which was its own kettle of fish and whose memory lives on to some extent in Ubisoft Connect, though I do find it to at least be more stable these days. I think back then I was running Windows Vista, which despite all of the problems with that thing, would at least run this game. I then soon upgraded to Windows 7, and neither Far Cry 3 nor Blood Dragon would be playable for me at all. I remember I once managed to get each of these games to run, but they would then crash whenever I tried to load a save. This is the reason I haven't played Far Cry 3 since 2013, and why I have never completed Blood Dragon. Luckily with Windows 10, the game does boot up through Steam, though it does open Ubisoft Connect 2, and it runs just fine and as expected. Except that every so often, usually when something new was loading in, like when I was approaching a tower or completing an objective or something, the game would hard crash. This happened so many times. Just a pause in the game and then a crash to desktop. So many times. I have trawled the internet looking for solutions. I disabled some touchscreen process running in the background, I updated my drivers, I changed compatibility modes, I tried everything I could find, and the crashes kept coming and they didn't stop coming. Luckily, Far Cry 3 has quick saves, so I had to get used to quick saving often to avoid losing too much progress. However, like how Far Cry 1 didn't allow quick saves at all because they wanted players to experiment with their playstyles, Far Cry 3 prevents quick saves during missions. So if I was taking a particularly long time to get through a mission, I'd have the added pressure of trying to beat it before a crash occurred. And those fears were realised a few times, particularly late in the game, where there's a couple of missions in a row where you are stripped of your gear and have to carefully make your way through an enemy camp. That tension becomes annoyance fairly quickly when you have to replay a 20-minute section because the stupid game can't hold itself together long enough through a cutscene. And that really puts me in an awkward position when ranking this game. If this game had a remaster or something on PC that made it actually stable, then this wouldn't be an issue, at least I would certainly hope not. But as it stands at the moment, the version available through Steam, and I assume Ubisoft Connect, have problems that will put some people off playing, and it put me off playing the game for over 10 years. I am really hoping that Blood Dragon is a bit more stable, but given my personal history with that, I'm not entirely convinced. And before anyone jumps to the comments to say, oh, well, it runs fine for me, blah blah blah, or whatever, just fuck off with that. No one is impressed. If you're not having issues with it, great, I'm jealous, but you stating that helps no one and just seems like you're making excuses for one of the biggest companies in the industry for not fixing issues with arguably the most important game they ever released. Also, no one likes you, fuck off. So in terms of ranking, there's also the issue of these three games all being incredibly different from each other. Obviously this is my personal opinion, but I can absolutely see the perspective of people that prefer the less open structure of the original, and while I would put a stable version of Far Cry 3 over Far Cry 2, again I can totally get that people prefer that harsh and unforgiving experience offered by the previous game. But for me, putting aside the frustration caused by the crashes, this game sits at the top of the list so far. This very literally changed gaming in several different ways that are still being felt to this day. Other companies, and even the company that made this thing, are still trying to create something as impactful and unique as this game is. And yes, I do realise the irony of calling this game unique, seeing as so many carbon copies of it have been released since. It kind of makes the definition of insanity speech hit differently, knowing that Ubisoft did start doing the same shit over and over again, except I guess they were expecting the same results rather than something different. So with that monumental release out of the way, it's on to Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, the April Fool's joke that turns out to actually be a real game, and one that I've never seen the end of because of those technical problems I was just whinging about. Will I be able to complete it this time? Subscribe to the channel to find out, because God knows when I'll be able to get that video out. Also, if you're still here, would you kindly give the video a like? You made it this far, so it must at least be semi-entertaining, right? Unless you hate watching it, in which case I appreciate the view count and hope you at least have nice wanks instead of hateful ones.